So as we move on in the second reading, we kind of get to the really hard part, I would say. But let's remind ourselves of what is going on in the second half of the Phaedo. And what's going on, I think, is that Socrates has to respond to two fundamental objections to the idea that the soul outlives the body. Because what is he trying to establish? He's trying to establish that that let's say that the soul can exist independently of the body. And remember that he has defined death from the beginning as a separation of soul and body. But I guess this first I mean, and you can put it in a lot of different ways, and perhaps I think it's always good when you're working with philosophical ideas to put them in as many ways as you can to see different sides of the idea and different sides of the problem. But I think that this first way of formulating it is the most relevant, the most pertinent. The assumption is that there is something called soul, and that it coexists with body while we're human beings. And the very extravagant, very radical, very difficult to prove idea that Socrates is trying to establish is that this thing that we call soul, and I would say, what are we talking about when we talk about soul? Remember, the word is the Greek word psyche, where we get psychology. We could also say mind, even intellect. That these, again, I mean, none of these things have important distinctions between them for philosophers, but we're trying to get a general idea of the kind of thing that Socrates has in mind in our translation when it says the word soul. That these things, that this aspect of the human being can exist apart from our organism, our physiology. Of course, we understand physiology much better than the Greeks did 2,500 years ago. We have much more of an understanding, for instance, of the importance of the brain and the nervous system and the way that the senses actually operate in the human body or any organism. But I think that, generally speaking, we can still discuss things in the same terms that Socrates did if we were willing to bend a little bit with the word soul. That these phenomena of consciousness, sensibility, sensation, mind, intellect, really the mental, I guess, as opposed that it can exist independently of body and is not totally dependent on the body. That's partly, I think, it's a large part of what Socrates is trying to establish. So we go to this first objection, Simeon's conception of soul as a kind of a harmony. Socrates has his way of attacking that. And that is to try to point out some fairly obvious things about soul. fairly obvious things about mind and intellect, and how its relation to the body differs from the relation of the harmony or sounds, harmonious sounds, how they relate to the actual physical instrument, the strings, let's say, of the lyre. And one of the things he points out is that the kind of sound produced by a musical instrument will be entirely a product of the physical state of the instrument. So that, for instance, if you hit a middle C or key on a piano, the sound that comes out of it will be a C. I mean, if you hit that particular key on a piano or a particular collection of keys on the piano to strike a chord, the sound or the harmony that results will be entirely determined by the keys that are hit. So that there's no independence of the harmony from the physical instrument. The physical instrument entirely determines the state of the harmony. That is not the case with the relationship between mind and body, let's say. And one of the things he points out is that mind can say no to body. That is, if I am thirsty, if I have the symptoms of thirst in my body, that does not necessarily mean I will take a drink. That is, I can say no, my mind, my will, let's say, can say no to the feelings, desires, needs of the body. I mean, there's a limit to that. I think we would agree. But that the state of my mind, what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, is not entirely a product of the state of my body, which argues against the idea, the whole analogy that Simeon has suggested, that the soul's relationship to the body is the same as the harmony's relationship to the musical instrument itself. The soul exhibits a kind of independence from the body already in life, which is a notion that we are free beings. We are not entirely determined by the state of our physical bodies in terms of what we think, of what we do, of even what we feel. So I think that is probably a pretty good objection to the soul as harmony conception, is that it doesn't quite work out, in the sense that it does seem that the soul is independent, to some degree at least, of body. So that's one way of trying to break down the objections, but that's just the first objection. The second objection, which actually Socrates takes much more seriously, because in a certain sense the rest of the dialogue is, before it goes crazy at the end, and you should read to the end, Socrates starts to tell this myth about what's underneath the earth and things like that, and then at the very end there's his death scene where he actually drinks the hemlock. But at the end of the actual philosophical argument part, or till the end of that, is really a response to this idea that we have no reason to believe that although the soul may be more durable and more long-lasting than the body, maybe the body clearly dies. Organic bodies clearly dissolve. They die. They cease to function. That even if we believe that the immaterial part of us, the soul or the mind, that it is more perfect or less perishable than the body, there's no reason to believe that it doesn't eventually wear out. I mean, what he's really asking is, why should we think that the soul is deathless, that the soul is immortal? It might just be very long lasting, and souls may eventually wear out, just like bodies do, but it just may take longer. I don't really consider that to be as interesting as the soul as harmony objection, because I suppose the soul as harmony objection is much more contemporary. in the sense that it brings up the issue of mind and consciousness and its relationship with the physical body, and how we probably tend in a modern scientific way to view consciousness as being dependent on body. So it seems like a much stronger argument or a much stronger objection to the idea of the soul being able to exist independently of body. But this is the one that Socrates really spends the most time on, and he actually goes so far to engage in a really fascinating bit of autobiography here. He tells about his youth when he first got interested in philosophy and he wanted to know the truth of things. This is, I guess, on page 7, where he begins to relate his kind of intellectual development. And what he says is that he was really interested in finding out the truth of things, the origin of things, how the world worked. And he was very interested in physical science. The Greeks did have physical science. It was not correct physical science. They had a lot of misconceptions about the natural world, both physics and biology. They had no notion of chemistry. But they did study the natural world, and Socrates believed that the way that you were going to find out the truths of philosophy was basically by natural science, by physics. And really about his disappointment with that, and how he abandoned that way of looking at things. And he said that he took a different route to try to discover truth. And the route was not through the senses. The route was through reason and argumentation. He calls it the second best mode of inquiring into the cause. That is, he knew that, or he felt that to actually try to find out the truth of things through examining the physical world, it was just not going to work. There were too many contradictions. So the second best mode is basically philosophy, discussion, logic, pure reason, and argumentation. So he abandoned the senses. And he says here in the middle of the page, so in my own case, I was afraid that my soul might be blinded altogether if I looked at things with my eyes or tried to apprehend them by the help of the senses. And I thought that I had better have recourse to the world of mind and seek there the truth of existence, which is basically saying to seek the truth through argumentation, through logic. And this leads to basically his, again, what emerges as his theory of the forms. Like this idea of what makes something beautiful. Well, the presence of beauty. What makes two things equal? Well, the presence of equality. He even gets maybe a little silly. What makes something large? The presence of largeness, and it's much parodied and sometimes ridiculed. But Socrates knows that it may sound silly, but he's saying, well, this is, I think, the safest route. The presence of these essences or these absolutes or these forms is what he would regard as the way to gain truth. And then after this really fascinating but difficult autobiographical account of his philosophical development, one can ask, what does this have to do with the question at hand? And I'll give you, just because I know this is getting long, the kind of short version of this. And that is, says, well, we're talking about soul. We're asking about soul. And we're asking about, the soul is alive. That is, what is essential about the soul? It's essential attribute. Essential attribute is life. And he compares that to, let's say something like the number 3. Um, Number three is an odd number. That is part of its essence. Part of what it is that it is odd. And so whenever you have three, you also have the odd. So if you add one, you no longer have three, and you now have something even, right? You have four. But you couldn't have three and evenness together. Three always brings along with it oddness. So think of that think of that, or use that as a way of conceptualizing soul and life. The essence of the soul is that it is alive. So think about something, try to imagine a dead soul. A dead soul would be a contradiction in terms, right? It would be like an even number three. So either something is the number three or it's not, but if it's number three, it is odd. Something is either a soul or it's not, but if something is a soul, it can't be dead because the essence of soul is life. Now, I'm giving you a very general, very cursory account of what I take to be the upshot of a very difficult argument that runs, really till the end here. He's talking about three and evenness and oddness, and it's a difficult argument, and maybe it's so difficult or it's so subtle that it's really not convincing. Maybe, I don't know, but I think we can say two things. One is that Socrates is giving it all he's got, and by that I mean Socrates is pulling out all the stops and using every argument at his command to try to establish the fundamental thesis, and that is the immortality of the soul. And what he's trying to prove in the last argument is that death does not apply to soul. Earlier, there was a much more, I think, comprehensible argument, the argument from affinity. And I like that argument better because I understand it better. I'm more clear about, I think, how it's trying to argue for the immortality of the soul. But one of the things that strikes me is that, if you think about something like a concept, like the concept of three, it's not something that could ever wear out, perish, become corrupted, etc. It just wouldn't make any sense to say that, because concepts like three mathematical concepts don't exist in that sort of way. They exist in this sort of timeless, if they exist at all, they exist in this sort of timeless, eternal way. Well, Socrates is saying that soul is like that. The word death doesn't apply to it. Death applies to body. Change and change and dissolution or deterioration apply to physical objects like buildings like the Parthenon or organic bodies. Logically speaking, they cannot die. Now we can maybe think. When I say logically speaking, it's a logical mistake to say that the soul dies. It's not that, well, we have a soul that will live forever, so much as the word death it's in a different category. It's what the philosophers would call a category mistake. I'll leave you with one. I know this is a very long video if you've made it this far. One of the things that I think helped me, maybe not with these particular arguments, but with Plato's doctrine of the immortality of the soul in general, was reading and being called upon to teach at a certain point the great Hindu poem and philosophical treatise, the Bhagavad-Gita, which was written not around the same time, I think, as Plato lived, maybe a little bit afterwards. The Bhagavad-Gita is a great philosophical religious poem that takes place on a battlefield just before a battle is about to start. And it's a conversation between a great warrior and the god, Krishna. And the great warrior, whose name is Arjuna, he looks across the battlefield at the opposing army just before the war starts, and he says, I know these guys. I love them. I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to kill them. And he throws down his weapon and he says he won't fight. And Krishna kind of laughs at him and he says, wait a second, you think that you can really kill them, huh? And he's like, yeah, of course I can. Stab them or shoot them with an arrow. And he's like, well, you're just killing their bodies, Krishna says to Arjuna. Who they really are, which is essentially their soul or their self, this immaterial part of them, that's immortal. And that's the kind of thing that can't be killed. So if you stab somebody in the heart, you kill their body, but you can't stab somebody in the soul. So basically he's saying to Krishna, you're taking this all too seriously. You can't really kill them. They're not really dead. That's only looking at the surface of things. You can kill their bodies, but they are not their bodies. Whatever they are and whatever you are and whatever I am is something distinct from body and something that has never been born and can never die, something that's eternal. Now, of course, there's all sorts of philosophical objections or questions that we may have, but I don't think that's too far from the conception of soul in general that Plato has. Now, whether he's successful in arguing that that's the correct conception, that, let's see, all the things that he's sort of assuming here, a human being is both body and soul. Death is their separation. Afterwards, the body decays, but the soul continues its existence. That is the gist, I think, of his conception of things. Now, how successful he is in arguing it, I think that's for everyone to decide for themselves.